Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel and as a podcast from wherever you get your podcast from. And remember, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And joining me today is historian and author Eric Wittenberg. Welcome, Eric.
Thanks, Daz. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, today's discussion is about the Battle of Brandy Station and JEB Stuart's ride to Gettysburg, and of course it is the 160th anniversary of those events. But before we get into that, Eric, would you mind telling us a little bit about how you got into the American Civil War in the first place, please?
Sure. Well, I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania, not far from Philadelphia, in an area that is filled with history. And pretty much anywhere you turn, you'll see something historical. And as an 8-year-old third grader, I got taken to Gettysburg for the first time. And by the end of the day, that day, I was completely hooked. And next day, I went down to the public library and started checking out books on the Civil War and read everything I could get my hands on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so before we get into the battle again, can you please explain how cavalry is used and its purpose during the American Civil War, if you wouldn't mind?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question because it's something that evolved over the course of time. The traditional role of cavalry, which was, well, let me even go back further. In 1861, the United States Army had a total of 5 mounted regiments that served different purposes. You had a regiment or 2 regiments of dragoons, which were equipped to fight both mounted and dismounted. You had a regiment of mounted rifles, which was fundamentally mounted infantry that used their horses to move from place to place, dismount and fight like infantry. And finally, you had 2 regiments of light cavalry that were really designed to operate on the frontier, to be fast moving and to perform various duties, but fighting was not one of their primary roles. With the beginning of the Civil War, all of those units were reorganized and redesignated as United States Cavalry, and suddenly those distinctions, were gone. And when those distinctions were gone, then you had changes in the mission, and the mission evolved into typically 3 major roles, at least in the early phase of the war. And those 3 primary roles were scouting, screening, and reconnaissance. Scouting, finding the way for the army; screening, preventing the enemy from finding your army; and reconnaissance was just that, reconnoitering positions to get intelligence about enemy dispositions. As technology changed, and in particular as repeating carbines came into play in 1864 and 65, that mission evolved into almost a mounted strike force, sort of a prototype for modern armored operations, where every man was armed with a force multiplying weapon that fired either 7 or 16 shots, depending whether it was a Spencer carbine or a Henry rifle. And they were really used as a mounted army and as a mounted strike force, in addition to providing those traditional roles of cavalry.
Okay, thank you. And okay, so can you try and give us an idea of, at this stage of the American Civil War, 1863, what the morale is like for the Confederate cavalry and the Union cavalry? Because I know it's slightly different, isn't it?
It is, and I need to ask you specifically what phase of 1863 you're talking about, because
So
things will change dramatically during that year.
yeah, so before the Battle of Brandy Station, the beginning part, and that part of the Civil War, and maybe even the back end of 1862. What is
Uh,
the morale like for these 2 different units?
Okay, so early in the Civil War, the Union High Command was extremely resistant to the idea of bringing volunteer cavalry regiments under the umbrella of the Army. it was falsely but sincerely believed that it would take up to 5 years for these volunteer cavalry regiments to be made effective and efficient, uh, simply because so many of the northern young men who populated these regiments were not accustomed to horses. They weren't accustomed to riding. They weren't accustomed to taking care of animals. They lived in cities. They worked in factories. They had no reason to be around horses. So in the beginning, at least, the Union did not make very good use of its mounted forces. Regiments were typically split up and sent out to serve as either orderlies or messengers. There was not effective use of them until, of all people, John Pope came east. Pope had had success in dealing with volunteer cavalry regiments during his campaigns in the Western Theater, and he brought that concept of brigading regiments of volunteer cavalry east with him. And two of the three brigades of cavalry assigned to his Army of Virginia, those of John Buford and George Bayard, performed exceptional service during the short life of Pope's Army of Virginia. So things are beginning to turn a bit, but it doesn't really take place until February of 1863, when the newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac, Joseph Hooker, took a recommendation from Division Commander Alfred Pleasonton to mass the 12,000 or so mounted soldiers assigned to the Army of the Potomac into a single corps with a unitary corps structure. It ended up being split up into 3 divisions, and then there was also an independent reserve brigade. This began to work wonders for morale. Really, though, it was the March 17, 1863 Battle of Kelly's Ford, where William Woods Averill's 2nd Cavalry Division crossed behind enemy lines and engaged with Fitzhugh Lee's Cavalry Brigade for a full day, and basically fought them to a standstill for the first time before withdrawing when Averill lost his nerve. Then comes the Stoneman Raid associated with the Chancellorsville Campaign. During the Stoneman Raid, the Union cavalry is in fact massed at one point and then sent out like as it was described, a bursting shell across the Virginia countryside, trying to do different things. The Stoneman Raid should not have been ordered. Hooker in turn blamed George Stoneman for his defeat at Chancellorsville, when Hooker was the one who didn't call off the raid after mission security was lost. And Stoneman will leave the Army to take medical leave on May 15, 1863, and never takes command of cavalry troopers with the Army of the Potomac again. And at that point, the senior division commander, who is Brigadier General Alfred Pleasonton, the commander of the 1st Cavalry Division of the Army of the Potomac, takes temporary command of the Cavalry Corps, and then that temporary command becomes permanent in August of 63 after the Battle of Gettysburg. At that point, you have finally started to get rid of a lot of the dead wood, and competent officers are coming to the forefront. You have 2 extremely capable division commanders in John Buford and David McMurtry Gregg, and 1 not so capable. The senior officer in Averill's division, after Averill was removed from command, was a French deserter by the name of Alfred Duffier. Duffier had been a lieutenant of cavalry of hussars specifically in the French army. He'd been decorated during the Crimean War, but he met an American woman who was serving as a nurse and took French leave to come to the United States to marry this woman. He was a good drill sergeant and a good drill master, and he probably was a pretty good lieutenant. But once you got him beyond that level, the Peter principle begins to kick in, and he eventually achieves his highest level of incompetence and remains there for a while, which is divisional command, something he was not qualified for and didn't do well in. And he was relieved of divisional command shortly after the Battle of Brandy Station, when Pleasonton reorganized the Cavalry Corps in order to eliminate his command and return him to regimental command as the commander of the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry. So it's the combination of the massing of the forces, it's the Battle of Kelly's Ford, it's the Stoneman Raid. All of those things combine to cause the Union troopers to realize that maybe they can compete with the Confederates on an even basis.
Mm-hmm. Great stuff. So what set of circumstances is going to lead them to have a battle at Brandy Station? And can you just explain a little bit about the location of where it actually is, please?
Sure. So Brandy Station is 12 miles from the town of Culpeper Courthouse. It was a stop on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. Culpeper Courthouse, today just known as Culpeper, is approximately 60 miles from Washington, D.C. in north central Virginia. It's an important place because of the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, plus its road network. After the Battle of Chancellorsville, JEB Stuart will begin to mass his cavalry in the good fields to the north of the town of Culpeper near Brandy Station. And he'll have a grand review on May 22nd of his troopers. He'll have another one on June 5th. Robert E. Lee was unable to attend the one on June 5th, so Lee ordered another one for 3 days later on June 8th. So you have 3 grand reviews of the Confederate cavalry. By the time of the June 8th grand review, Stuart has with him 4 brigades of cavalry. He's got the brigades of Fitzhugh Lee, Wade Hampton, William Henry Fitzhugh Rooney Lee, the second son of General Lee, and he also will have with him William Edmondson Jones's brigade and 5 brigades, and Beverly Robertson's small but and very green brigade of 2 regiments of North Carolina troopers. So there are approximately 9,000 Confederate cavalry that have been massed there. This large massing of cavalry has made Joe Hooker extremely nervous. He is concerned that he's going to be the victim of another ride around his army like Stuart has done to McClellan twice, and he will end up giving Pleasonton orders to take his entire 12,000-man force and to destroy or disperse the great concentration of Confederate cavalry in Culpeper County. And that's almost word for word what the orders said. Pleasonton has heard rumors, quite accurate as it were, that there was Confederate infantry nearby. So he will ask to have 3,000 hand-selected troops sent with him as infantry that'll divide into 2 pro hoc brigades of infantry, one commanded by David Russell, Brigadier General David Russell of the 6th Corps, and one commanded by Brigadier General Adelbert Ames of the 11th Corps. And he'll divide the command into 2 wings. John Buford will command the right wing, which will consist of the infantry under Russell, under Ames, and it will also include the 3 divisions or 3 brigades of Buford's division, Buford having taken over command of the 1st Division when Pleasonton was elevated to corps command. The other wing will consist of David Russell's infantry, as well as the divisions of Gregg and Duffier, with David Gregg as the commander of that wing. And Buford was to cross the Rappahannock River at Beverly's Ford and advance on Culpeper from the north. Gregg and Duffier were to cross at Kelly's Ford, which is 6 miles downstream from Beverly's Ford, with Gregg advancing on Culpeper in a pincers movement with Buford, while Duffier guarded the flank. That's how it was supposed to be. All of that assumed that the Confederates were much closer to Culpeper than what they were, and unfortunately, the whole plan was based on flawed intelligence. And I'm reminded of what Field Marshal von Moltke said when he made the comment about how no plan survives first contact, and Brandy Station is a great example of that.
Mm-hmm. So, okay then, so we get to the 9th of June then. So could you take us through what actually happens at the Battle of Brandy Station, please, mate?
I could. Do you happen to have a map? There we go. Very good. Thank you. So what we have here is the two crossings on the Rappahannock River, Buford in the upper center, Gregg and Duffier at Kelly's Ford further down. You will see that when Benjamin Grimes Davis's brigade of Buford's division makes its way across the Rappahannock River, they discover, to their great surprise, Confederate pickets on the other side of the river when there weren't expected to be any there. So they will end up fighting their way through those pickets. That in turn will send up the alarm, and Grumble Jones will roust his command. He'll end up jumping on his horse bareback and without his boots to lead his troopers into battle. The delay entailed by the attack on Jones's pickets will enable a large concentration of the Confederate horse artillery, which had camped in the fields between where you see St. James Church there and Beverly's Ford and the Cunningham Farm there, to escape rather than all being captured. And this is, of course, the legendary Stuart horse artillery. All of that stuff will pull back to a prominent ridge line right by St. James Episcopal Church that you see there, and there they will open fire. In the meantime, Davis will be killed in hand-to-hand combat with an officer of the 6th Virginia Cavalry. He'll fall dead to the ground, or mortally wounded, and die shortly thereafter, after getting a pistol ball to the brain. His command will fall back, disoriented and demoralized, and eventually have to be rallied and brought forward. And when they come forward, they will end up running into, on two fronts, Rooney Lee's brigade, which has come to the sound of the guns and taken up a position behind a stout stone wall, and also the brigade of Wade Hampton, which has joined Jones's brigade in and around the Beverly Ford Road. So you'll end up having lengthy combat. There'll be a mounted charge that will be made to capture the guns on the St. James Church Plateau, made primarily by the 5 companies of the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry that were part of the Reserve Brigade, and eventually the 6th U.S. Cavalry will join in to support that charge. They'll make it all the way to the muzzles of the guns before they're repulsed. John Buford will later describe it as a charge of conspicuous gallantry, and will from that moment forward describe the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry as his 7th regulars, which is really quite a compliment if you think about it, especially from a crusty old regular like Buford. A lull will then fall across the battlefield, and at about 11 o'clock in the morning, finally, they start to hear some guns barking in the direction of Fleetwood Hill, which you see again on almost dead center of the map, just above where it says Stuart. David Gregg will arrive after having gotten lost and then having to wait for Duffier. They will clear Beverly Robertson's 2 regiments of North Carolinians out, who will bug out after firing a single round, and that's their entire participation in the Battle of Brandy Station. They'll make their way to Fleetwood Hill. Fleetwood Hill was occupied at that point by Stuart's headquarters tent, some orderlies, and a single piece of artillery that had gone there to refill its limber chest. Major Henry Baynard McClellan, who was a first cousin of George McClellan, who was Stuart's adjutant, was up there on the hill, and he sees this very large column of Union cavalry approaching. He orders that Lieutenant Tuck Carter deploy his gun and open up on the advancing Union troopers, and start sending orderly after orderly to Stuart, who's over by St. James Church, advising him that he's got a problem on his hands. And Confederate cavalry arrives in time, specifically troopers of Jones's brigade and later Hampton's brigade arrive in time to repulse the initial attack by Colonel Sir Percy Wyndham's brigade of Gregg's division. Wyndham, of course, is one of your countrymen, Daz. He's an interesting fellow. He's a self-described mercenary with one of the great mustaches you'll ever see. Had been knighted by King Victor Emmanuel during the wars in Italy, the wars of unification in Italy. And he's going to end up leading his brigade. They will make it to the crest of Fleetwood Hill before being driven off by Grumble Jones's men. Wyndham will be severely wounded in the leg, will not command troops in the field again, as he will eventually be cashiered from the army for allegedly being disloyal to the U.S. government. Two senior officers of the 1st New Jersey are also mortally wounded in combat, one of them being their Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Broderick, and his senior Major John Shellmeyer will both be mortally wounded and die on the field. Another one of their captains will end up being severely wounded, left on the field for dead, ends up in Libby prison, and ends up as part of a drama that will take place over the exchange of prisoners in the winter of 1864. So Wyndham's command will be driven off the hill. Elements of Wyndham's command made it almost all the way to Beauregard, which you see is the Barber House there that's indicated just to the left of where you see Jones' second position. Robert E. Lee and Richard Stoddert Ewell were on the front porch of Beauregard watching the action, and this detachment of Union troopers got driven over there and did not realize who was there, or they might have captured Lee and Ewell. So they get driven off, and then once they get driven off, then up comes Judson Kilpatrick's brigade, which will also engage with the Confederate cavalry on Fleetwood Hill. You note they took a little different approach. They also get to the crest of Fleetwood Hill before Hampton's brigade, and specifically the Cobb Legion of Georgia cavalry, arrive and repulse them and send them, as Kilpatrick described it, fluttering like feathers on the wind away. So after about 3 hours of very intense hand-to-hand fighting, everything you would imagine of mounted combat, of cavalry, charges, counter-charges, sabers, pistols, you name it, eventually Gregg will break off and withdraw, and that shifts the action back to John Buford, who by this time has been itching to attack, but Pleasonton's been holding him back. Excuse me. And finally, Pleasonton gives him the go-ahead, and enlisting the assistance of a couple of companies of infantry from the 20th Massachusetts and 3rd Wisconsin, they will finally drive Rooney Lee's men away from a stone wall, and they will then make a mounted charge up what's called U Ridge, which is the ridge between St. James Church and Fleetwood Hill. You see it there where the arrows are just below Buford. And there they will engage in some very heavy mounted combat. There'll be another charge by the 6th Pennsylvania, another company by the 6th U.S. There'll be hand-to-hand combat between troopers of the 2nd U.S. and some of Rooney Lee's men, and specifically Captain Wesley Merritt, the commander of the 2nd U.S., will engage in one-on-one combat with Rooney Lee. He will wound Lee in the leg, and General Lee will later see his son being carried off the field wounded. They'll make it to the crest of Fleetwood Hill. Buford describes reaching the crest of Fleetwood Hill, where he can oversee Brandy Station, and then the unexpected late arrival of Fitzhugh Lee's brigade, which at that point is commanded by Colonel Thomas Taylor Munford, will end up driving Buford back, and at that point Buford has received orders to break off and disengage, and that's what he will do. In the meantime, because of the presence of Union infantry, at one point Robert E. Lee will order Ewell to send some infantry up, and specifically they will send up a couple of brigades of Ewell's corps, one of which was Edward Asbury O'Neill's brigade, and they will make it to about where you see the word railroad. on the Orange and Alexandria, hidden the whole time, out of view, but available in case they needed to come up to support. So that's how close they came to finding the Confederate infantry. In the meantime, Duffier, excuse me, who has been very strictly following his orders without any deviation and without any inventiveness in order to try to go to the sounds of the guns, will advance along the Stevensburg Road until they reach Hansborough's Ridge, which it's marked there, the Ridge, where they'll run into Matthew Calbraith Butler's 2nd South Carolina Cavalry. There'll be a melee in the road between some troopers of Duffier's division under command of Colonel Luigi Palma di Cesnola of the 4th New York. Wade Hampton's brother, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hampton, will be mortally wounded in this melee. Butler will end up having to fall back. In the meantime, Colonel Williams Wickham's 4th Virginia Cavalry, which has been sent to reinforce Butler, comes onto the field just as Di Cesnola's charge is hitting, and they will break and run like sheep for the first time in the war, greatly embarrassing Wickham and leaving Butler's command exposed. Wade Hampton will later blame Williams Wickham for his brother's death. Butler will then fall back to some high ground along what John Buford in the winter of '63 will describe as a vicious little stream called Mountain Run. You see Mountain Run depicted there. If you see where it says Butler in his 2nd position, you see the stream through there. They'll end up in a position on the north bank of Mountain Run at a place called Norman's Mill, and they will make a stand there, at least attempt to. Duffier is going to deploy troopers and artillery on a high piece of ground. He'll have with him the battery of Lieutenant Alexander Cummings McWhorter Pennington, that being Battery M, 2nd U.S. Artillery. And Pennington's going to see 2 high-ranking officers sitting on their horses having a conference. He will personally sight a gun. He will personally pull the lanyard, and that shot will pass through first the horse of Captain Will Farley, who was Stuart's favorite scout, who Butler was talking to, through Butler's horse, Old Benchlegs, and that same artillery shell will take off Farley's leg and Butler's leg. Farley will bleed to death in a matter of a few minutes. Butler's life will be saved, but he'll lose his leg. He'll end up turning over command to Major Thomas Lipscomb of the 2nd South Carolina with orders not to fight mounted, and they'll eventually get driven off. And by the time that Duffier finally decides to go and join Gregg, he's just in time to meet the retreating column of Gregg's column as it's leaving the field. So I'm not normally one to engage in what ifs, but had Duffier arrived at Gregg's assistance at Fleetwood Hill, instead of going off in his little jaunt to Stevensburg, imagine that 2 full divisions of Union cavalry against 2 brigades were pretty good odds, and it's entirely likely that Stuart would have been defeated and had to abandon the field. But as it were, the Union troopers eventually leaving the field in Stuart's hands. Each side has suffered significant casualties. There are about 950 on the Confederate side and over 1,000 on the Union side. Stuart was excoriated in the Richmond newspapers for having been surprised, but the reality of the situation is he fought a very good fight, and at the end of the day, he won the battle. Now, Pleasonton, who was known to have a terrible allergy, it's an allergy that he shared with Phil Sheridan. Both of them were very allergic to telling the truth, will lie about having supposedly captured Stuart's field desk and Lee's orders for the invasion of the North, but that simply never happened. Stuart never reported losing his desk. He never reported losing orders, and it was just simply a justification for Pleasonton's complete failure to accomplish the objectives that were laid out for him in his operational orders from Hooker. Destroy or disperse the great concentration of Confederate cavalry, and he did neither. So in every fashion, Brandy Station has to be considered a Confederate victory, but at the same time, it was clearly the turning point for the Yankee cavalry, because from that moment forward, the Confederates finally learned to respect them. And from that moment forward, they fought on even terms, because if for no other reason, the Union cavalry finally came to believe in itself. So
Yeah.
that's Brandy.
And I mean, you answered my question there anyway, because my next question was, even though the Union lose this battle, the morale of the Union cavalry is even higher after this, isn't it? Because, like you said, they can go toe to toe finally with the Confederate cavalry, can't they?
And they did so for 14 hours that day.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And yeah, but it's always, I don't know why, Brandy Station has always been seen as sort of like, again, even though it's a Confederate victory, as a Union victory in a way. It's really strange.
I think it's for a couple of reasons. One of them is from the fact that they did catch Stuart completely by surprise.
Mm-hmm.
And they, at least in the early phases of the fighting, carried the day on both fronts until the Confederates finally drove them off through some very hard, very determined fighting.
Yeah. Well, anyway, thanks for explaining the Battle of Brandy Station. And
Sure thing. And I might also point out that 3 days later, Pleasonton reorganized his cavalry and merged the 2nd and 3rd divisions together in order to get rid of Alfred Duffier as a division commander.
okay, cool. Thanks for adding that. Okay, let's turn our attentions to JEB Stuart. So, how does sorry, yeah. So, what kind of effect does this actually have on because again, like you said, it was a victory for Stuart, really, wasn't it? So, does this have an effect on his morale? Does it have an effect on his mindset?
Well, that's a good question. We're left to try to psychoanalyze the man 160 years later, and some historians have speculated that Stuart was determined to redeem himself for having been caught off guard. There's no question he was angry about the newspaper coverage, but and that's why he went on his what they call the ride.
Yeah.
That there's no evidence to support that.
Mm-hmm.
What the evidence demonstrates is that Stuart suggested making himself useful to the army after the Battle of Upperville on June 21st, which was indeed his first actual battlefield defeat. He proposed taking the cavalry on an expedition that was approved first by Longstreet and then by Robert E. Lee himself, that gave him discretionary orders that had holes in them big enough to drive a truck through. And if you read those orders carefully, and you then look at exactly what it is that Stuart did on his so-called ride, I would maintain that Stuart obeyed those orders to the letter. And those orders were, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's not exact, but it's close. If he found that the Army of the Potomac was on the move, and he also found that 2 brigades could guard the mountain passes through the South Mountain Range to protect Lee's lines of communication and supply, he was then to move to the east of South Mountain, cross the Potomac River, find Ewell's Right, known to be operating somewhere between Harrisburg and York, Pennsylvania, and to gather supplies for use by the Army and to do all the damage he could to the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
He obeyed those orders to the letter. So he gets them on the 22nd of June. They spend the 23rd preparing, and they march on the 24th. They are going on intelligence that was provided to him by John Singleton Mosby, who was indeed his favorite scout, particularly after Will Farley's death. The intelligence that was passed along by Mosby was that there were no Union troops operating in the Loudoun Valley being the valley between the Bull Run Mountains and the South Mountain Range, and that Stuart could cross at a place called Glasscock's Gap, enter the Loudoun Valley, and make his way up. The problem is that shortly after Mosby sends those orders, the entire Second Corps of the Army of the Potomac advances right up the Loudoun Valley. So that when Stuart gets his orders, or gets this report and orders his men to march, and they reach the mouth of the gap, they're in front of them, arrayed in front of them, is Winfield Scott Hancock's veterans. Well, Stuart's got 4,000 men with him and 4 pieces of artillery. He doesn't have anywhere near the manpower to take on the entire Second Corps with its entire brigade of artillery. So he'll engage in some desultory skirmishing with them. There'll be an artillery duel between James Breathitt's battery of horse artillery and some of the Second Corps artillery, and a couple of soldiers from one of the main infantry regiments are killed by artillery fire. And then Stuart breaks off and withdraws, and he goes to a place called Buckland Mills, where he tries to meet up with Mosby. And he waits for Mosby for 10 hours, but Mosby doesn't show up. Why? He's been cut off by the Union infantry. So Stuart decides to move on, and you can see the problem. Already he's way behind schedule by virtue of this chance encounter with the Second Corps. So he knows he's got to go around them. So he goes around them to the south to a place called Wolf Run Shoals on Bull Run. He crosses that, and then he comes up to the east of the Bull Run Mountains and ends up at a place called Fairfax Courthouse. He arrives at Fairfax Courthouse the day after the Army of the Potomac has abandoned it as its headquarters. There's still a ton of Union supplies there, and Stuart's men are hungry, and he can't prevent them from helping themselves once they get there. But before they get there, they got a problem on their hands. And that is, there is a small detachment of about 85 troopers of the 11th New York Cavalry, also known as Scott's 900, commanded by a fellow named Major S. Pierre Remington. If you're familiar with the famous American Western sculptor, Frederick Remington, that was his father. Mm-hmm. And with 85 troopers, Major Remington orders a charge. And they charge into the head of Hampton's column, and there's some pretty nasty hand-to-hand fighting, and many of Remington's men are captured, and those who aren't captured end up escaping, and but they slow down and cost Stuart a half a day. And then once Stuart gets into Fairfax Courthouse, his men are going to help themselves to all these supplies, things like chocolate and tobacco and canned sardines and all sorts of other delicacies. So when he gets to Fairfax Station on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, he's going to have the telegrapher send a report to Richmond that's going to advise the War Department in Richmond that the Army of the Potomac has abandoned its headquarters there and is moving north in response to Lee's army. It's received in Richmond. You know how we know that? It was published in a Richmond newspaper verbatim a few days later. So we know that the telegram got there. What we don't know is what happened to the couriers that Stuart sent out to try to reach Lee to advise him. They got captured. So the word never got to Lee, and the War Department didn't do anything to make sure that Lee got that intelligence. But when you hear that Stuart did nothing to try and communicate intelligence to General Lee along this march, you now know for a fact that that's not true.
Wow, yeah, I didn't know any of that myself, really. Honestly, it's really opened my eyes. Yeah, because I was going to ask, was he trying to... So obviously when the Army of Northern Virginia leaves for the Pennsylvania campaign itself, does JEB Stuart obviously know that they've left, and do they sort of leave around the same sort of time? So he knows he has to get intelligence back to him, doesn't he? So he obviously... I didn't know he actually tried to. I really didn't know that. So thanks for adding that.
Sure, and there's two sources for it. Like I said, the telegram from Stuart was published verbatim in one of the Richmond newspapers a few days later, but there's also a very famous diary that was published after the war by a fellow named John Beauchamp Jones, who was a clerk in the Confederate War Department, and that was the title of his published work, a clerk in the Confederate War Department's diary. And Jones, who saw the telegram when it came in, wrote it out in verbatim in his diary, and it was published when the diary was published. So that's two different sources that demonstrate clearly that the Confederate War Department got the telegram that Stuart sent. It's beyond dispute.
Yeah.
So when Stuart finally breaks free from Fairfax State Courthouse, he now is going to head for the Potomac River. And he's aware that Union cavalry is picketing nearly all of the fords on the Potomac River. It happens, and he stumbled upon it. There was one ford that was not picketed, and that was called Rouser's Ford. The 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry, which was supposed to be picketing there, never got the order because the courier bringing the order got captured. So it was the only significant ford on the Potomac River that was left unguarded. So Stuart and his men will cross there. They'll capture a detachment of Union engineers on the other side of the river after making their way across the C&O Canal. They'll have to stop for a while to parole those guys. They then head on to Rockville, Maryland, in the outskirts of Washington, where they will capture a 150 wagon train of brand new wagons, each pulled by 6 fat mules, each of which was loaded with high-grade fodder. Now, what do you use fodder for, Daz?
Not sure. Sorry.
Feeding horses.
There you go. Yeah, you need that. You've got a lot of horses.
And what were Stuart's orders? Capture supplies by use of the army.
Yep.
So he captures the wagon train, but now he's got 150 wagons and 600 mules to worry about. And mules are not known as stubborn creatures for no reason. It's not a cliche. It is, in fact, true. If a mule doesn't want to do something, it won't. And keeping those mules moving became a real challenge for Stuart, but he's got to bring them along, but it slows him down. In the meantime, his presence at Rockville creates total panic in Washington, D.C. They're absolutely convinced in the capital that Stuart's going to come into the capital, but instead he heads north, and he's going to go first to a place called Crooksville, and then he's going to go to Sykesville on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, just above where you see the number 5 and the red arrow there, red broken arrow. And they will stop there because there is a stop on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad there. They'll destroy the water tower. They'll tear down the telegraph lines, but not before Stuart playfully sends a telegram to the Union, the Federal War Department in Washington. And they just missed capturing a train. If they'd gotten there an hour earlier, they would have captured a train that was carrying Joseph Hooker back to Baltimore, so he could then go to Washington, D.C., having been relieved of command of the Army of the Potomac.
Wow.
So they just missed capturing Hooker.
Huh.
They head on to Westminster, Maryland, and when they get to Westminster, there is a detachment of the 1st Delaware Cavalry, which is assigned to the Middle Military District, the 8th Army Corps, which is based in Baltimore, which has been picketing there. Why? Because what do you see there? You see a railroad that passes through Westminster. That's the Western Maryland Railroad, and it will end up serving as the Army of the Potomac's main supply line while it's operating in that vicinity. So there's this detachment of Union cavalry and a company of infantry of a New York regiment, the 150th New York, commanded by a fellow named Lieutenant Pulaski Bowman. As the Confederate cavalry is coming up the road, some pickets from the 1st Delaware spot them. They ride back and report to their company commander, who's a fellow by the name of Captain Charles Corbett, that the Confederates are coming. Corbett can't find his commanding officer because his commanding officer, a fellow with the magnificent martial name of Major Napoleon Bonaparte Knight, whose martial skills did not come close to matching the splendor of his name, was bellied up to a bar in Westminster, 3 sheets to the wind. So Corbett's going to end up ordering his 85 men to charge. And they will crash into the head of Fitzlee's column, and 2 lieutenants of the 4th Virginia Cavalry will be killed. One of them is still buried in a church graveyard in Westminster. Eventually, Most of the men of Corbett's command will end up being captured after some pretty heavy hand-to-hand, saber-to-saber fighting. Later that evening, Major Knight will collect 12 men. That's all that escaped. The others were captured. But this, again, it cost Stuart a half a day, and then he's got to make his way through town. Some of Breathitt's artillerymen were from Williamsport or from Westminster. There were a lot of Confederate sympathizers there, and they were greeted as conquering heroes. So when they finally break loose from there, they end up traveling a few more miles up the road to a place called Union Mills, which again you see on the map. They'll spend the night of June 29th camped at Union Mills. Union Mills was a grist mill, a flour mill, and it was owned by two brothers with the last name of Shriver, Shriver. One was a Union sympathizer, one was a Confederate sympathizer. One of them was the grandfather of Sergeant Shriver. Do you know who Sergeant Shriver was, Daz?
No, sorry.
He was George McGovern's vice presidential candidate in the 1972 presidential election, who was married to one of JFK's sisters.
Okay.
His daughter, I know you've heard of, her name is Maria. She was married to Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Okay.
That's the family.
Wow.
So Stuart's men will camp at Union Mills that night, and the Confederate sympathizing Mrs. Shriver will feed Stuart and his officers. Stuart, in turn, will sit at the piano and play and sing for them. They'll camp there in the morning. Stuart is desperate to find someone to guide him who knows the area, and he determines that Mrs. Shriver's 16-year-old son, Herb, is the one who should go. Mrs. Shriver understandably didn't want Herb to go. Stuart promised that he would keep Herb at his side and keep him safe, and that, by the way, if Mrs. Shriver allowed Herb to come with him, he would arrange for Herb to be admitted to the Virginia Military Institute. Finally, Mrs. Shriver agreed, and they rode out with Herb leading the way. The next year, in May of 1864, when the VMI cadets came out to fight Franz Sigel at New Market, Herbert Shriver was one of those cadets that came out to fight.
Mm-hmm.
So Stuart fulfilled his promise. Union Mills is 3-4 miles below the Mason-Dixon line, and they're on their way to Hanover. And of course, when they arrive in Hanover on June 30th, they run into Judson Kilpatrick's division, two newly promoted brigadier generals commanding his brigades. Having been promoted on June 28th, it's now June 30th. George Armstrong Custer is assigned to command the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, and a young staff officer by the name of Captain Elon Farnsworth gets promoted and takes command of the other brigade. And Farnsworth's guys do the bulk of the fighting at Hanover. It's an interesting fight because Hanover was a good-sized town. It was a market town, and there ends up being quite a bit of mounted charges and countercharges right through the center square of town. In other words, urban mounted combat. Very unusual in the American Civil War.
Yeah.
It's also where Custer and his Wolverines debut their Spencers. They help to repulse an attack. And Stuart, at the end of the day, is happy when Kilpatrick breaks off and leaves, because he's actually under orders to be somewhere else, and is not really, it had not been intended to end up in a full day battle, and that's exactly what happens. Now, in the meantime, remember that Stuart and his cavalry spent the night of June 29th at Union Mills. The night of June 30th, the 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac spent the night camped at Union Mills. That's how close behind Stuart's tail they were. They just didn't know it.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So Stuart, in turn, is going to leave Hanover. He's heard that Jubal Early's division is in York, so he's going to make the march from Hanover to York, which is approximately 25 miles. It's at night. His men are exhausted. Guys are falling asleep in the saddle and falling from their horses. They get to York early in the morning of July 1 and find out that Early's gone. that he's already been ordered to go to Gettysburg with the concentration of the army. Now, what's interesting is that while the fighting was going on at Hanover, Early was about 8 miles away. He heard the Union and Confederate artillery barking at Hanover, decided that it was nothing but militia, and didn't bother to send anybody to look and see what was going on in his rear, despite the fact that he had 2.5 regiments of cavalry with him. All he had to do was send out a party to go find Stuart. Stuart would have been able to disengage from Kilpatrick and would have advanced to Gettysburg with Early on July 1. And imagine when Early makes his attack on the end of the 11th Corps line on the morning, morning of July 1, that he's got Stuart's troopers leading the way. That's what it should have been.
Oh, wow.
But it wasn't. So unable to find Early, Stuart at this point decides, okay, I've heard that the other 2 divisions of Ewell's Corps are operating somewhere between Carlisle and Harrisburg. Fitz Lee in particular knows that area well because he has spent a significant portion of his regular Army career training cavalrymen at the Carlisle barracks. So they go and they set out for Carlisle. And the area between York and Carlisle is one ridge line after another. Up, down, up, down. It's got to be just exhausting for men and horses. They end up dropping Hampton's brigade and the wagon train at a place called Dillsburg, which is more or less where the number 5 is on the map between York and Carlisle. So Stuart will go to Carlisle with Chambliss's brigade, Fitz Lee's brigade, now commanded by Colonel John Randolph Chambliss of the 13th Virginia Cavalry, with Fitz Lee's brigade and the 4 guns of Breathitt's battery, and they expect to find Confederate infantry in Carlisle when they get there, and they're quite surprised to find when they get there Union infantry from the defenses of Harrisburg instead. These are New York and Pennsylvania militiamen commanded by Major General William F. Baldy Smith, and a single battery of artillery. Well, these guys aren't very good soldiers, but they're there. So Stuart orders Breathitt's guns to unlimber, and they open fire on Carlisle. They set the town gasworks ablaze. They send a detachment over to burn the Carlisle barracks, and then Stuart sends Fitz Lee's younger brother, Henry Lee, into town with a flag of truce demanding that Smith surrender. Smith sends back a note that says, "Shell away and be damned." So they open fire again, and a second note is sent into town, and Smith again refuses to surrender. Now, in the meantime, earlier that day, Stuart has sent a bunch of staff officers out to try to find the Confederate Army. One of them, Major Andrew Venable, hears the guns at Gettysburg. And like a good soldier will do, he rides to the sound of the guns. And he arrives at Richard Stoddard Ewell's headquarters at about 8 o'clock in the evening on July 1st, after the first day's fighting is petered out. Ewell takes Major Venable to Robert E. Lee. Lee, in turn, orders Venable to go back to Stuart and tell Stuart that the army is concentrating at Gettysburg and that he should come join. Venable arrives back at Carlisle, which is 35 miles away, about 2 o'clock in the morning. He gives Stuart his orders. Stuart orders one last volley of artillery fire to be shelled into the town, and then they limber up and they head south, having to pass over South Mountain on their way to Gettysburg. Arriving in Gettysburg, Stuart arrives in Gettysburg about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on July 2nd. His troopers arrive later in the day. Hampton and the wagon train will have a fight at Hunterstown at about 6 o'clock in the evening on July 2nd, and will then make their way to the battlefield. Now, if you've seen Mr. Turner's movie...
Yeah, I was going to bring that up, actually, yeah.
You've seen the scene where Lee supposedly dresses Stuart down and Stuart offers to resign. That never happened.
Mm-hmm.
There were 4 people who were in that room and knew what happened: Lee, Stuart, and Charles Marshall and Charles Venable, who were Lee's two military secretaries, and none of them left an account. Now, you would think that if there had been some sort of an ugly exchange between Lee and Stuart, somebody would have written about it, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Stuart, in particular, wrote a letter to his wife a couple of days later where he talked about what a good time he had in Pennsylvania. And I guarantee you that had he been dressed down by Robert E. Lee, he would have said something to Flora about it.
Mm-hmm.
It never happened.
No. So that was going to be my question, So do you think it's the movie that's made this whole situation up as, like in the movie they mention, oh, he's up north getting his name in the paper, and then like you said, you get this scene in the movie, don't you? So do you think that's what's made people believe that, Stuart goes off and doesn't communicate and stuff like that,
I'll tell you where it comes from. It came from a post-war account by Colonel Thomas Munford of the 2nd Virginia Cavalry.
Okay.
Munford was not present. When this happened, Munford was still making his way from Carlisle. He was at least 15 miles away, if not more. So what Munford is repeating is what we lawyers call hearsay.
Yeah.
He's repeating what somebody else told him.
Well, yeah, it's like, as we call it, Chinese whispers. Somebody says something that it changes, it goes to the next person, changes again.
Precisely.
So like that.
But that's the only source for this, is an account left by Munford. And then Michael Shera, who wrote The Killer Angels, picked it up and repeated it in the novel, which in turn meant that it got repeated in the movie. But it never happened.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you what, mate, you've definitely opened my eyes to the whole campaign. It's there's a lot of stuff I didn't know there myself. Obviously, I know a bit about it, but wow, really interesting. And so thanks for giving us all that information. I want to turn the attention back to Brandy Station and the battlefield itself, because I know you do give tours there sometimes and that, don't you? So
I do.
Just give us an idea of, if people wanted to go and visit Brandy Station, what they could expect to see nowadays.
So fortunately, after, and this is probably another talk for another time because it's not a short story, but after a protracted preservation fight that lasted for the better part of a decade, the then APCWS, the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, was able to acquire everything that you see in green that's on the other side of the Beverly Ford Road from the Culpeper Regional Airport. That was supposed to originally have been turned into an office park. When they drove that developer into bankruptcy, some idiot was going to build a Formula One racetrack there. And that didn't happen either. They drove that developer into bankruptcy. And then the trust was able to acquire a large piece of ground out there. They then acquired the area around St. James Church, and you see that also in green where it says St. James Church Walking Trail. And then they have also acquired a big chunk of ground, about 60 acres at the crest of Fleetwood Hill, and some ground on the other side of Fleetwood Hill. I would say at this point that the battlefield is probably 50 to 60% owned by the American Battlefield Trust.
Nice, that's great. And
so those portions of the battlefield that are owned by the trust are open to visitation by the public. As you can see on your map here, there are indeed several walking trails that you can take and visit significant portions of the battlefield, including there's a 1.3 mile trail around the crest of Fleetwood Hill now too. And it's well worth a visit. They're in the process of replacing the historical markers out there. Some of them were so old that they were so faded from being exposed to the sun that they couldn't be read anymore. And I know that they're in the process of replacing those. And if you don't have the opportunity to go with a guide, you can do a self-guided tour pretty easily.
Yeah. And so I'm going to ask you, Eric, obviously, because I know you've written a couple of books on the subject of Brandy Station. So how important was it for you that you managed to get to go and walk some of this ground and see it for yourself? Because it's important you see a battlefield, isn't it, to try and understand it, isn't it?
It is. And I have an old friend who is a retired Army combat engineer from the U.S. Army who once said to me years ago when I was really getting started with all of this, he said, the ground is the primary source.
Hmm.
The terrain is the primary source. The terrain drives the action. It's not the other way around. So in order for you to truly understand these events and to truly understand tactics and decision making, you have to understand the terrain. I made my first visit to the Brandy Station battlefield in 1994, and we were trespassing the whole time we were there.
Hmm.
Um, my friend Bud Hall, who is responsible for saving that battlefield, uh, had permission to go on the ground when he wanted to, and I was with Bud, but it was very clear to me that we were trespassing, and we had to be careful about it. Subsequently, I have probably spent somewhere between 25 and 30 full days on that battlefield. I've walked nearly every inch of it. I know that terrain. It's what enables me to do the work that I do, because I do that whenever I write a book about a battle. I will not put pen to paper until I've spent time on the ground and come to understand it.
Hmm. And would you say it's one of your favorite places to go?
Absolutely. It is absolutely a gorgeous piece of ground. Fleetwood
Hmm.
Hill is the highest point between there and the Atlantic Ocean.
Oh,
It
wow.
is known as the famous plateau. It is
Hmm.
a beautiful piece of ground, and these open fields were pretty ideal for mounted operations. I regret the fact that the Culpeper Regional Airport is where it is, because it is on battlefield land. Can't do much about that at this point.
No.
Uh, but at least the bulk of the battlefield has been preserved, and the bulk of it is pristine.
Hmm.
Now, there was a large, I describe it as a McMansion built on the crest of Fleetwood Hill by the owner just to uh, stick it in the eye of the preservationists, and he made a mistake. There's a creek at the bottom of the hill called Flat Run. You can sort of see it on the map. Flat Run is a perennial tributary to the Rappahannock River, which means it is squarely within the jurisdiction of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And this guy dammed up Flat Run without the permits to do it. Uh, he was reported to the Army Corps of Engineers and the Virginia Environmental Protection Agency, and they came down on him like a ton of bricks. And that was when he decided to sell the land on Fleetwood Hill, and how the trust was able to acquire it. And
Wow.
the McMansion was torn down after they raised the money to buy the land, which cost several $1 million. And I've worked with the trust on preservation stuff a lot, and they've never asked me to do something that I haven't said absolutely and done so gladly and willingly. And I've never asked for anything until that house came down. I did ask for something. I asked for a brick.
There you go.
And after the house was demolished one day, I was at work, and the mailman brought me a box. And when I saw the return address, it felt the weight. I knew what it was. And that brick
Love
is
that.
upstairs in my library
What a
above my
great story.
desk.
Oh, fantastic, mate. Absolutely brilliant. Anyway, I'm going to ask you about your, because you have got many books on certain subjects, but you have on this particular subject, you've got a couple on Brandy Station, and is this one of your most recent ones, A Plenty of Blame to Go Round, or is that, I can't remember.
2000, no, that one was 2004, I think,
Okay. So
2005. The
just
most the
sorry.
most recent one is a 2-volume set that I did with my friend Scott Mingus that's
Oh,
titled
that's it. Yeah.
If We
And
Are
that's
Striking for Pennsylvania. And
it.
I wrote an account of Brandy Station that appears in there.
Okay. So yeah, so just give people an idea of they could expect from these books, just pretty much basically what you said in the podcast, really, isn't it? I suppose
With a lot more detail.
with a lot more details, yeah. So, but anyway, ladies and gentlemen, if you do want any of Eric's books, then please, you can find them on Amazon and just type in Eric Wittenberg, basically. Um,
Or
but
my site,
yeah,
ericwittenberg.com.
yes, I will put that in the links for all the ladies and gentlemen, Eric. But Eric, all that's left to say is thank you very much. It's been absolutely fascinating, and really good, and so thank you very much.
My pleasure, Daz. I'll be happy to come back sometime if you like.
I will definitely have you back, mate. Cheers.